COVID restrictions mean that many won't be able to mark this most important day in the way that they usually would and would certainly want to. But of course, it's still a time to reflect on the immense sacrifice of one generation. To mark the occasion, we had an interview this week with the Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Nick Carter. I was busy with our US election coverage, so my top colleague, Deborah Haynes, our Foreign Affairs editor, went along to speak to the head of the British Armed Forces.
It's a unique time. The country under lockdown, an economic crisis that we haven't known for generations. Why should people care about remembrance?
Well, I think the most important thing about it is that it's about honouring those who gave their lives in the service of our country. And of course, they did that to protect our way of life and our freedom. And I think it would be very dangerous if we forgot that. Not least, I think, because we need to hang on to that idea of democracy.
Why is that dangerous if we don't remember the sacrifice of the past?
Well, because I think that what we will also forget is the true horror of war. And if you forget about the horror of war, then the great risk, I think, is that people might think that going to war is a reasonable thing to do. Now, in certain circumstances, that might be the case. But of course, you need to understand what you're taking on when you do it, because it's always visceral, it's always violent, it's always brutal. And ultimately, it leads to people having to sacrifice their lives in the cause. And that's quite a thing for people to do. So we need to remember that. We need to learn from it, and we need to make sure that people only take us to war when they absolutely have to.
And looking at history, history tells us that economic crises lead to security crises. How worried are you that the global economic crisis brought on by coronavirus could lead to new security threats, potentially even war?
Yes, I think we're living at a moment in time where the world is a very uncertain and anxious place. And of course, the dynamic of global competition is a feature of our lives as well. And I think the real risk we have with quite a lot of the regional conflicts that are going on at the moment is you could see escalation lead to miscalculation. And that's the thing I think we have to guard against.
Miscalculation, can you just spell that out in easy language? What does that mean?
So what that means is that the protagonists, either because they don't realise the implications of their actions, lead to an escalation, which means that more people perhaps get involved, more weaponry gets involved, and before you can contain it, it leads to the sides ending up in a full-blown war. And if that happens, as we saw in the last century, we have to remember history might not repeat itself, but it has a rhythm. And if you look back at the last century, before both world wars, I think it was unarguable that there was escalation that led to the miscalculation, which ultimately led to war at a scale we would hopefully never see again.
So are you saying that's a real threat, that there could be another world war?
I'm saying it's a risk, and I think we need to be conscious of those risks. And that's why remembrance matters, because if you look back at history, hopefully you learn from their experience and you make sure that you're very cautious about how you manage the sorts of regional conflicts that we see playing out in the world today.
Looking at coronavirus, the first time round, it seemed that the government was kind of almost wary, reluctant to use the military. The armed forces being involved on the streets may be a sign that things aren't going so well. Was that frustrating for you? And do you think that this time around, in the second wave, we'll see even more military presence? Obviously, the military have already done a lot.
I don't think the government was in any way reluctant to use the armed forces. I think it's always a question about what the armed forces can do. And of course, over the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of times that the armed forces have been deployed in support of the civil authority, whether it was the 2012 Olympics, which you'll remember. But equally, there's been a lot of bad weather over the course of the last 10 years, and often we're deployed in support of flooding. Now, I don't think the government has ever felt that it was inappropriate to do that, or indeed that it showed that things had gone wrong. The answer is that the armed forces are there to provide that level of national resilience. So I don't think there was any reluctance to use the armed forces. I think, like all these things, it's about working out how you can use the armed forces in the most effective way. And actually, I've been hugely proud of what we've contributed. We've done it behind the scenes. We've been supporting the health workers on the front line, and we've applied some quite imaginative ideas to how we can help them. And I think what we did with constructing the Nightingale hospitals, which sadly look like they'll be back in use again, what we've done in terms of some quite imaginative work in the testing programme, and indeed what we did to deliver PPE, the personal protection equipment at scale, all of that, I think, are indications of how the armed forces can turn their hands to most things when they're required to as part of that national resilience.
We've been told by the Defence Secretary that there are 7,500 military personnel ready as part of this winter defence force. Can you imagine all of them potentially having to be used over the coming months?
Well, of course, we always aim off for contingencies, and we're aiming off for all sorts of things that might happen this winter, not least bad weather. So the answer is I don't know, but we are prepared for whatever eventuality might happen. And of course, we're about to deploy 2,000 or so people up to Liverpool to take part in this multi-testing pilot scheme that's underway. And I suspect that if that works successfully, we might find that there are other areas where we need to help in a similar sort of fashion.
So test and trace, it's a key, fundamentally, a big logistical challenge. I mean, isn't that exactly what the armed forces are designed to be able to achieve? Wouldn't it make much more sense just to give that whole piece of important work to the military and let them run the command and control and run that test and trace programme?
Well, I mean, it is an option, but I think at the moment we should have confidence in the testing system. I mean, when you think back in May, we were only able to do 10,000 tests a day. We're now doing 500,000 tests a day, and that is on a very steep path at the moment. And I think actually the testing thing has been a really impressive effort. The trace thing is another matter altogether, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily a military task. Of course, we'll step up to the plate if we're invited to do it, but I've got confidence in the system at the moment.
But you say it's an option. Like, have you ever offered the military up to be this solution to help the country deal with the challenge of having an effective testing programme?
I think we've always been clear in defence that we're available, and the government's always known we are. Ultimately, you want sustainable solutions. And what we must never lose sight of course, is that our principal purpose is to deter the country's enemies, and we do that on an ongoing basis. And whilst it is entirely appropriate for us to help in times of crisis, what the government really needs are sustainable solutions so that we're available to do what we should be doing on a normal daily basis.
Well, that leads us on very nicely to the integrated review. Obviously, there's this big review going on that's been going on for months now of UK defence foreign development policy. For you, how important or how hopeful are you that defence will be given a multi-year settlement from the Treasury, even though obviously we've heard from the Treasury that most other departments will be only getting a one-year budget?
I mean, the answer is I don't know. At the moment, there are negotiations going on in a very constructive way. We absolutely understand the challenge the country has, and we've talked in this interview about the very difficult fiscal situation. And of course, from the Treasury's perspective, you need to be sure of your fiscal assumptions before you're clear about whatever the future might hold, and therefore what a long-term settlement might look like. But clearly, from our perspective, we're going to argue for something like that because we need long-term investment, because long-term investment gives us the opportunity to have confidence in modernisation. Modernisation essentially means that you're going to park some capabilities that are perhaps from the industrial age and want to look forward to some of the capabilities you need for an information age. And having the confidence to do that, of course, means you need confidence in your long-term investment.
I mean, on that front, should the country be ready when they look at their military to have a very different-looking armed forces going forwards, that actually fixating on the size of the armed forces, on this 82,000-strong army, is actually the wrong metric, and what you should be looking at is capability, increased use of autonomous weapons, increased use of cyber, of space, to be able to have maximum effect? Are we going to see a smaller armed forces, but a more powerful armed forces?
I think you're going to see an armed forces that's designed for the 2030s. I mean, you won't get there overnight, but that's the direction of travel. And we think that an armed forces designed for then is going to be one that is organised through the prism of the domains of land, air and maritime, but also cyber and space, because it's the way that you integrate all of those domains together these days and certainly into the future that gives you your disruptive edge. So I think you'll see armed forces that are designed to do that. And I think that absolutely means that we will have all manner of different people employed because those domains require different skill sets. And we will absolutely avail ourselves of autonomous platforms and robotics wherever we can. But we don't yet know, and nobody can predict the future, quite what mix of technologies will be necessary to be able to achieve that. And that's why returning to the lost art of experimentation, something that perhaps we haven't done constructively since the 1930s, is something that we'll absolutely have to do.
But can you spell that out? Does that mean like the 82,000 figure is going to go and it's going to be a smaller actual military?
No, I can't spell that out, not least because decisions haven't been taken. But what I'm hinting at is that we need to be thinking about how we measure effect in a different way. I mean, I suspect we could have an army of 120,000, of which 30,000 might be robots, who knows? But the answer is we need to open our minds to perhaps numbers not determining what we should be doing, but rather the effect that we can achieve is really what we should be looking for.
The UK threat level has risen. We've seen terror attacks in Austria and in France. Is this a sign of a resurgent Islamic State, a resurgent Islamist extremist threat that could play out here in the UK too?
I mean, the answer is I don't know. And of course, our thoughts are absolutely with those who've been affected in France and, of course, in Austria. The plain fact is that the challenge of Daesh, of the Islamic State, has not gone away. And we have forces deployed in parts of the world at the moment which are dealing with that particular challenge. It's a clear and present threat, and it's one that we should all be alert to.
The Overseas Operations Bill is obviously passing through Parliament at the moment. You'll be fully aware of the concerns that have been raised, particularly by Labour and also by a number of Conservative MPs, that this is giving a carte blanche to the UK Armed Forces to commit war crimes, potentially torture. What do you say to that?
I mean, my starting point would always be that if our forces do not behave in line with our values and standards and the laws of war on the ground, then they should be properly held to account for that. But I would also say that we have been struggling with vexatious claims from the campaigns of Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade or two. And that is something which I can't condone, because ultimately that threatens the way in which our leaders on the ground are prepared to seize those fleeting opportunities that you need to win on a battlefield. So the trick is to maintain the moral high ground, which is fundamental to us, and we must never lose that, and therefore we must be held to account, whilst at the same time trying to make sure that vexatious claims don't pursue us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Deborah Haynes there talking